Hey guys, it's Dr. Noseworthy back, and we're still talking about labs that I would spend my own money on, and we're going to try to finish off part 3, I think it is. We're talking about stool testing is, one of the, what I call tier 1 tests that I would consider. Before we get started, let me make note, the last couple of episodes I recorded while I was traveling, and I had one of those technology issues where my computer crashed literally the day before we left Eastern Canada to drive back to Florida. And so I recorded the last 2 episodes on my iPad, which unfortunately I don't have a setup to do that with good quality. So my apologies if the audio quality for those episodes and for this one is not up to snuff. It drives me crazy when some things happen. I was just in a time crunch in a situation where I couldn't get it fixed before I left. And so my laptop should be restored to me either today or tomorrow, and any future episode should be back to good quality. So thanks for hanging out with me. I know sometimes that bad audio and the lagging time frame, if you're watching it on the video versions, can really get quite annoying. So I get it. My apologies. So a couple of takeaways from the last time we chatted. One would be that, microbiome or microbiota testing is a tricky deal in the sense that we can test for a ton of different things, different species, but we don't know much about all of them, nor do we have techniques to intentionally manipulate someone's microbiome to support only those things that are out of balance. So that's one thing to think about. Most importantly, though, if you're planning on going through a gut protocol, either on your own, say that you decide to take advantage of my 5-step gut protocol program that you can find on my website, or maybe you're working with a practitioner and they're putting it together for you, realize that the job is not done at the point where your symptoms are resolved. And this is part of the key to avoiding reinfection, which is quite common. Don't stop what you're doing when your gut feels good and your bowels begin to behave. You have to think in terms of restoring total gut health. You want to be infection-free, of course. You want to also have a robust microbiome that is producing postbiotics, as they should. And you need to not have things like gut inflammation, leaky gut, and so on. And you need to have a balanced gut-based immune system. And these are all things that we talk about in the 5-step gut protocol program. Now, I promised that we would talk some about biofilm and then say a few things about leaky gut. Let's talk about biofilm. I'm unaware of any labs that do stool-based biofilm testing. I've requested a couple of labs develop that technology for us because I think it would be quite valuable to me as a clinician and to my clients as a consequence of that. But so far, we don't have that. And I don't know if there are technical issues with testing biofilm in stool samples. There is at least one lab that tests for biofilm in the oral cavity, and that's usually in the context of things like periodontal disease. And I often use the lab that tests for biofilm and something called MARCONs, which are antibiotic-resistant staph infections that are in the deep sinuses, but that's got nothing to do with the stool, of course. And there is a lab called Fry Labs that will do some biofilm testing in a limited sense in like blood samples, but that again has nothing to do with the stool. So there are some labs that are capable of testing biofilm in different media, but it's not extended to the point where we can do that in GI testing. But despite the lack of testing, we know that biofilm is a very common problem in gut infections. In fact, I've seen data in several papers where the numbers go as high as 82% of gut infections involve biofilm, which puts us in a position of assuming that it's an issue rather than assuming that it's not. If I can't test to prove that you do or do not have it, then just based on the probability, we have to assume it's an issue. And I have said this before in different contexts, but I kind of have a rule that if I'm going to make an error, I'm going to err on the side of caution. I'll assume that you have something and then proceed as if you do, rather than assuming that you don't and proceed as if you don't. Because if I'm going to be wrong, I'd rather be more cautious on that. Now, my current understanding is that all fungal and most bacterial species form biofilm. And even though I haven't checked in the last year or so, I've found no evidence in prior literature searches that organisms like viruses or parasites form biofilm. But that doesn't mean that they're not there in biofilm. So let me explain that. Biofilm is basically a, let's call it a gooey, ooey polysaccharide matrix that these organisms produce to protect themselves from your own immune system. And when organisms inhabit your gut, they essentially collude together to protect themselves. And they produce this biofilm, which acts like a shelter, like a shield that they hide behind. And they hide inside it. And by doing that, they evade detection by your immune system. They also protect themselves against things like medications, particularly antibiotics. And so they're there, but your gut and your immune system doesn't really know it. And so the infection is allowed to persist. And this is, in many cases, where a lot of chronicity comes from. And so gut critters either live inside the biofilm in what's called the sessile form, or they live outside the biofilm in what's called the planktonic form or the planktonic state. And, you know, when you do a stool test, you can only test for organisms or critters that are outside of the biofilm itself and in the free open space of your gut where it can get incorporated into your stool, which is the sample that you're testing. And so one thing to know about biofilm is, number one, it's very common in gut infections. Second thing to know is that when you have biofilm, your stool testing isn't showing you the entire picture. Stool testing of any kind cannot show if you have biofilm in there. Hopefully that will change. And if it shows, or if you can't find biofilm, you certainly can't tell what's hiding inside. In addition to that, research tells us that about 80% of the time, and again, the number is going to change depending on which papers you read, but about 80% of the time, the organisms inside the biofilm are organized into separate colonies or pockets. You might think of smaller bubbles inside a bigger bubble, and inside each bubble is a bunch of critters. And inside these bubbles or these microbial colonies are not just one type of critter, but many. In some cases, the literature says that these biofilm colonies are polymicrobial in the sense that they contain bacteria, they contain fungal species, viruses, and parasites, which pretty much runs the spectrum of these microorganisms. And so even though we don't see evidence of, say, parasites and viruses forming biofilm on their own, they still take advantage of the biofilm made by other species, and then they just join the party, and they're part of the community that lives inside the biofilm. And what borders on somewhat creepy is that inside the biofilm, these colonies use chemical signals to communicate with each other, and they even share DNA across species, to the point where some researchers say that the biofilm acts like a single living organism, so like a single unit made up of multiple subunits, kind of like with a hive mentality, if you will. And biofilms or biofilm is one of the reasons why some gut infections are so dang hard to get rid of. And it also explains a phenomena that we sometimes see in functional medicine, whereby someone's second test looks different or worse than the first. And this is something that really plagued me as a practitioner. When I first started doing this, I would put someone on a gut protocol, which I thought was going to be effective based on everything I knew about their gut and about the nature of certain herbal compounds as antimicrobials. And X number of weeks later, we would do a stool test. Usually at that point, they're asymptomatic and they're feeling much better. And sometimes the second test looked worse than the first one. And so it's what I call the biofilm phenomena, where if you retest too quickly, you're going to see a different result because you're going to see what's behind. And so let's say that you call me and we agree to work together in a one-on-one coaching capacity. I'm putting together your protocols for you and then walking you through the process of diagnostics and understanding how to change diet, lifestyle, and use supplementation to fix whatever it is we find. And let's say that we agree to do a pre-test and we get a handle on what your gut infection load is, what it looks like, and we get an idea of the picture of, say, your microbiota. And let's say that we know nothing about biofilm, but if you have it and we go through maybe a 6 or 8 week gut protocol using any number of antimicrobials, if you have biofilm, and if the herbs that we choose to treat your infection are also classified as biofilm disruptors. And if we retest too quickly, as I just mentioned, then your second stool test will look worse than your first one. The things that were there might be there in higher amounts, and there are new things that didn't show up on your first stool test. And, again, that plagued me for many years until I discovered biofilm in the research, and I started putting two and two together, and then started teaching this in functional medicine seminars to other doctors. Because when we disrupt biofilm, the critters that live inside the biofilm come outside the biofilm, and then they get incorporated into your stool, and then we can see that on a stool test. That's very simply what happens. And so, again, ever since I discovered biofilm in my own personal research, a decade or so ago, I've done a few things in crafting my own gut protocols and how I put them together for people, because I don't use the same protocol for everyone, because that would be silly. First, I assume that any stool report that I'm looking at is showing me the absolute best case scenario, in that it is statistically more likely in any given stool test that there is biofilm there, and there's more in someone's gut that I can see, because there's things hiding from the stool test inside the biofilm. So that's the first assumption that drives how I put together my protocols, that the report is best case scenario, is probably worse than that. Second, when I make sure that I use biofilm disruptors in my protocol. Yeah, and that can be any number of herbs. And I'll just name a few. For example, grapefruit seed extract, even garlic, berberine, black seed oil, cranberry extract. All of these compounds are in the literature, and there's, quite honestly, many more different ones that are classified as biofilm disruptors. And they might have different mechanisms of action, but at the end of the day, whether you inhibit new biofilm formation and over time it breaks down, or you do something or use something that actually degrades the biofilm, at some point you have less biofilm, you have more critters outside than inside, and you can deal with them and get rid of them. And so we can use antimicrobial herbal compounds, or we can use certain enzyme preparations. There are enzymes, for example, called serrapeptidases, and there's other classes, but these are known to degrade the biofilm. And then finally, understanding that your protocol is not done when your symptoms resolve, and that if you retest too soon, it can be confusing, since it tends to show you what was inside the biofilm, not reflected on the pre-test. And so as a result of that, I tend to increase the time frame of my gut protocols to make sure of two things. Number one, that I give enough time to disrupt the biofilm and take care of what was hidden in the first test. And then I also give enough time after symptoms resolve and people are feeling good to keep working on total gut health, which leads into lack of reinfection or preventing reinfection. But it also brings me to my final topic, and that is leaky gut. Now, leaky gut, and since I'm probably going to do a mini series on the gut, let me keep this section short and sweet, because we'll come back to this in more detail. If you look back, if you go to PubMed, the National Institute of Health, which is where all of our peer-reviewed literature is housed, and you can search that. The first study that had anything to do with leaky gut, or what's called intestinal permeability, was actually way back in 1925. That was a long time ago. But since then, there's a total of almost 20,000 studies published that has something to do with leaky gut. And more than half of those have come from since 2010. And what that means is, even though the concept of leaky gut has been known for basically 100 years, there was really hardly any emphasis placed on it in terms of research, which then drives changes in clinical protocols and applications. Again, about 2010. And I would say that even back in 2010, if I was teaching a seminar to a bunch of doctors of different types, 2010, hardly anyone had, well, they probably had, by that point, they had heard about leaky gut, but they didn't understand it. And they didn't know why they needed to account for it, test for it, how to test for it, and so on. And we've learned so much in the last decade or so, but let's consider about 2010 to be the turning point where the vast majority of research has come from. And we're at the point now where leaky gut has been implicated in pretty much every chronic inflammatory disease known to man, either as a contributing factor or as a consequence. And sometimes it's correlative, sometimes it's causative, meaning there might be some kind of a metabolic issue or pathology or pathophysiology that creates leaky gut and something else. And so they're there together, but the leaky gut is not causing it. Or we can have something causing leaky gut, which then causes something else, or we can have something causing something else, which then causes leaky gut. And at some point, your head just spins around and you think chicken and the egg. Doesn't really matter at this point. We have everything, and we just have to fix what we find. And that's typically the way that I suggest doctors proceed. That's the way I think. That's the way I do it. And so what has happened is this idea of permeability, which really did start with the cells that line in the intestines, what's called the gut epithelial cells. And essentially what we're talking about is this idea of leakiness, where cells that line a space inside of an organ fail to prevent things from passing into the bloodstream. They fail them from doing that. And, this idea of leakiness has expanded beyond the gut to basically any organ system that has cells that function in that way, which is pretty much all of your organs. And so at this point, it's not just about leaky gut. We can find literature on and evidence for leaky brain. In fact, we even have testing for leaky brain. Even though we don't have testing for leaky lung, not in the sense of formal lab testing, we know what to look for clinically. We know that leaky lung tends to promote susceptibility to recurrent upper respiratory infections, or even chronic bronchitis or recurrent pneumonia. We have papers that talk about leaky heart. And I'm not talking about heart valves that leak. I'm talking about the cells that line the chambers of the heart and the major blood vessels that go into and out of the heart, breaking down and not acting as a sophisticated filter, because that's what leakiness is all about, is that a set of cells that are responsible for acting like a filter to prevent things from going from one place to another don't work. And so things go from one place to another. Like, for example, there's a lot of toxins and other things in your gut that should never be in your bloodstream. But when you get leaky gut, then things get into your bloodstream, and it can cause a whole host of problems. And so again, it happens with gut, it happens with the brain, happens with the respiratory system and the lungs, it happens with the heart. And in fact, just looking around this morning before because I tend to try to think through what I'm going to talk about when I do these podcasts. And I went to PubMed and I found evidence of leaky liver. Who knew? Leaky liver. But it makes sense because the liver has certain types of what are called sinusoidal cells that are responsible for doing things. And they act very much like the cells that line the intestinal system, or the cells that line the blood vessels that go into the brain or the heart. And so anytime we have certain classes of cells that serve certain functions and they start to break down, then we get leakiness and so on. So what's the big deal and why does it matter? Well, very quickly, let's start off with a couple of caveats. Number one, you can't predict if somebody has a leaky gut or how bad it is by their symptoms or their diagnosis. In my early days when leaky gut became a real big thing, we saw all the research that connected autoimmune thyroid, for example, Hashimoto's disease with leaky gut. So we started, and this was, I think we all did this, we started thinking, well, everyone with Hashimoto's has leaky gut. And if you have leaky gut and you're genetically predisposed, you probably have Hashimoto's. That's, again, not necessarily true. And, to be honest, I've done too many leaky gut tests in my day when my own predictions were wrong. And so I'm at the point now where I always wait for the data. I've had clients that I've worked with who are in really bad shape, where I was like, oh, they're going to have a leaky gut that's going to be really bad, and then they don't. Or I might look at someone who's relatively stable and say, well, chances are they don't have a leaky gut, or if they do, it's not really bad. And then the lie comes back and it's terrible. And so I've learned to test and not guess. So I wait for the data to come back to give me that information. The other thing to know is that leaky gut has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And state-of-the-art testing looks for antibodies to what are called gut barrier proteins that are found in the blood that indicate that tissue damage has happened and that system is beginning to break down. And there are some other tests that have been around actually for longer than that, which involve drinking a solution and then checking to see if this shows up in your urine. There's all kinds of technical issues as well as immunological issues that prevent that from being an accurate and reliable test. Whereas if we can measure antibodies to certain proteins that are only associated with these barrier systems and they come up positive, then we know that your immune system is attacking and there is destruction to these tissues. Therefore, we know that you have a leaky gut. The other thing to know about leaky gut is that it makes everything worse, right? With leaky gut, there's more local gut inflammation. And this spills out systemically through a couple of different routes. One is vascular and the other one is through the lymphatic system. And basically, when gut-based inflammation from leaky gut goes systemic, it amplifies what you have going on elsewhere. And so we can't even say accurately that the classic symptoms of leaky gut are gut-based. In fact, you can have zero symptoms at all in your gut and yet still have a raging leaky gut. But maybe what you have is you have migraines, or maybe you've got brain fog and focus and concentration issues. Maybe you have joint swelling and pain. Maybe you have fatigue. Maybe you have something else. Again, leaky gut has been implicated in pretty much every chronic disease. And the vast majority of times, the symptoms that come from having leaky gut are systemic rather than simply being in the GI system itself. Other thing to think about is that fixing leaky gut is not just about the supplements that you use. When leaky gut information started coming from the research world into clinical practice through seminars generally, supplement companies started making leaky gut repair products, for lack of a better term. And they were, of course, all nutrient-based, and those are quite helpful, and sometimes they're absolutely necessary. But if you have a leaky gut and all you do is take some licorice root or some like increase your amount of L-glutamine as an amino acid, or if you take aloe vera, whatever, but you're not taking care of other things, then you're going to fail, which is why a lot of people don't understand why, hey, I read the AIP diet, I saw this podcast, and now I'm drinking bone broth, but I still have a leaky gut. Well, it's because intestinal permeability is a full-blown neuroendocrine immune problem where you may have to address other things other than just supplementation. You may have to change your diet. Usually you do. You may have to deal with stress chemistry in your adrenals. You may have to control your blood sugar better. You may have to balance hormones, fix your thyroid, control systemic inflammation, change your gut dysbiotic environment. You may have to pay attention to brain health and recover maybe from some old concussions and so on. And there's so many things. Like, you can't out supplement those problems if you don't know you have them, or if you know that you have them, but you're not dealing with them properly. And so I would say, as a general rule, yes, you want to use supplements to enhance the probability that you're going to fix the leaky gut, but you're not going to do it if all you're doing is drinking bone broth or taking glutamine or deglycyrrhizated licorice. It's just not going to happen, because if you have a leaky gut, it's because you have all these other things that tend to promote it. And that's just a much better approach. And finally, one thing to understand is that stool testing does not show you leaky gut. Right now, many labs are measuring, this is relatively new in the testing world, but many labs are measuring something called zonulin in your stool, since this compound called zonulin is known to cause an increase in permeability. And as an aside, everybody has an increase in the production of zonulin when they eat gluten. So anytime you eat gluten, you get a transient increase in intestinal permeability. You get kind of a short-term leaky gut, which may or may not amount to much in any given person, but for others, it's a big deal. And so maybe you're gluten sensitive, maybe you're not, but nevertheless, when you eat gluten, there's this transient increase in intestinal permeability that actually applies to everybody. So labs are now measuring zonulin because we know that it opens up what are called these tight junctions and creates this temporary increase in intestinal permeability. The problem is that zonulin levels vary constantly throughout the day. Sometimes they're higher, sometimes they're lower. It doesn't vary on like a circadian rhythm, in the sense that maybe your cortisol levels do, where it's tied to the clock, but nevertheless, they do vary throughout the day. In fact, there was a paper several years ago that came out when zonulin testing first started to become popular, which pointed this out. And it was encouraging caution in using zonulin as a diagnostic tool to look for intestinal permeability, again, because it varies. And so maybe that you do a test and the lab says, hey, your zonulin levels are normal. It does not mean you don't have a leaky gut. And if they just happen to be elevated at the time that you do your stool test, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a leaky gut as an ongoing clinical problem. It may just be a transient part of this ebb and flow, because what most people don't know, certainly most doctors, is that you always have some mild degree of permeability. The question is, as this ebb and flow changes, do you have an increased level that's persistent and perpetual? Do you have aggressive breakdown of the barrier system? There's always some degree of permeability. And we're not even getting into how certain organisms can hijack normal cellular function and cross the gut barrier even when you don't have a leaky gut. And there's so much information out there that just doesn't get trickled down into the hands of people like yourself, let alone getting into the world of clinical practitioners who are really trying to help people like yourself. A lot of stuff gets missed because people aren't paying attention to what's being published and looking at why certain labs might do certain things, when in fact it's just there's not enough clinical validation. Anyways, I can get on my soapbox again and start talking about that, but let me move on. Let me just say this: looking at zonulin is not a valid test of permeability. It doesn't diagnose it. It does show an increase in something that might be a trigger. But that's no different than seeing someone with a high hemoglobin A1C. And you may have heard of this test. It's usually done with people that we suspect have diabetes. And it's commonly interpreted that if you have a high hemoglobin A1C, you've got chronic high blood sugar. Maybe you're pre-diabetic, diabetic. Now, there are other reasons why A1C can go up, but that's the most common interpretation. But just because a high hemoglobin A1C can be associated with intestinal permeability, because there is a mechanism by which poor high blood sugar control can cause intestinal permeability, it doesn't mean it does. It doesn't mean it does. And so, again, just because someone has a high hemoglobin A1C does not mean they do have a leaky gut. That may or may not be true. You have to test for direct evidence of that. And so if it turns out that someone's eating a standard American diet, has a high hemoglobin A1C, high zonulin, they're chronically stressed, their cortisol levels are out of whack, their thyroid doesn't work well, will that person have an increased likelihood of leaky gut? Yes. Will it guarantee that they do have it? Can you diagnose it that way? Absolutely not. That's why we need good, accurate, valid, repeatable, reproducible, and reliable testing. Now, I will say this, that leaky gut is one of the most common tier 2 tests that I use. Remember that tier 1 is comprised of the most common tests that I would spend my own money on, because that gives me so much information about so many things that are so common among people with the most common health complaints. And if you forgot the list, it's a good set of blood labs, comprehensive enough to assess fundamental physiology in multiple systems. So blood labs, saliva testing for stress chemistry, and stool testing. And leaky gut is perhaps number 1, maybe number 2 in tier 2, because not everybody needs a leaky gut test. So tier 2 are the next most common tests that are commonly useful for some people, but not all, which is why they're tier 2. When, again, leaky gut testing is one of those. And that's where we're going to be going next in this series. What are the most common tier 2 tests that I would spend my own money on if I needed them? And so we'll save that for the next episode. Again, thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.